I'm Stephanie Singer, 43, a Master Sergeant's daughter from Peterson Air Force Base, who became a JSOC pilot known as WIDOWMAKER. For years, I supported a man I trusted, even helping protect his career when one mistake could have followed him forever. But when Colonel Michael Hadley dismissed me in a Pentagon war room, called me darling, and let other officers laugh like I didn't belong there, I made a choice that changed everything. Have you ever been underestimated or betrayed by someone you once stood beside? Tell me your story in the comments because you're not alone. Before I get into what happened, let me know where you're watching from. And if you've ever had to stand up for yourself after being wronged, hit the like button and subscribe for more true stories about boundaries, dignity, and reclaiming your worth. What happened next might surprise you. My father used to say the Air Force didn't give you a career, it gave you a purpose, and the rest was yours to build. He never said it to motivate me. He said it because it was accurate. That distinction matters. There's a difference between a man who tells you things because he wants to shape you and a man who tells you things because they are true. And my father, Master Sergeant Gerald Singer, 23 years in Air Force logistics, retired with full honors and an unshakable opinion about proper inventory documentation, was always the second kind. I grew up at Peterson Air Force Base in Colorado Springs, which means I grew up knowing the difference between a flight line and a front yard, between a dress uniform and a work uniform, between what the Air Force looked like from the outside and what it actually was when you lived inside it. The base had a grammar of its own, the gridded streets, the chain-link fence along the flight line, the schedule that organized everything from first formation to lights out. I absorbed that grammar before I could have named it. It was the first language I really learned, the one I still think in when the pressure is high and the margin is narrow. My father took me to air shows the way other fathers took their kids to baseball games, not as entertainment, but as education. He would point at a C-130 and tell me what it carried, how far it could go on a full fuel load, why it mattered that it arrived on schedule and not an hour late. He had opinions about payload efficiency and about which ground crews actually knew their aircraft versus which ones were managing appearances. He communicated respect through precision and expected the same in return. He never told me to fly. He never told me I couldn't. He just showed me what the mission looked like, over and over again, from the time I was 7 years old, and let me draw my own conclusions. By the time I was 12, I had drawn them. I want to be careful here about the word dream, because dreaming implies uncertainty. And by 12 years old, I had no uncertainty about this. It was not a hope or a wish or an aspiration. It was a decision made the way my father made decisions, by looking at the available information, determining what was required, and committing without reservation. The C-130s flew over base housing every morning on their way out to the training corridors, and I watched them from the chain-link fence, and every morning the accounting came out the same way. That was going to be me up there. Not someday, maybe. Definitely. What Peterson gave me, beyond the aircraft, was an early understanding of institutional life that most people don't acquire until they are well into their 20s. I understood before I was old enough to articulate it that institutions embed values in their schedules, their protocols, their hierarchies, and that your job, if you want to be any good at what you do, is to find those values and build yourself around them rather than waiting for someone to hand them to you. My father modeled this without naming it. He was a master sergeant because he had earned every grade on the way, and he treated each one with the seriousness it warranted. That was the lesson, not the rank itself, the seriousness with which you hold it. In June of 1999, at 16 years old, I was accepted to a summer aviation program that included a solo glider flight. I was the youngest in my cohort and the only one who did not look surprised when the instructor cleared me for solo. The glider handled differently than I expected, quieter than any simulator had prepared me for, more sensitive to thermal shifts, demanding a different kind of attention than the powered simulators I had logged hours on through the base youth program. I made 2 corrections on approach that I later wrote up in my program journal as lessons learned, with notes on the specific thermal patterns over the ridge east of the airfield, and why the standard approach heading needed adjustment in afternoon conditions. The instructor read the journal that evening and told me I thought like a pilot. I told him I had been thinking like one for 9 years. He laughed. I was not joking. I had been preparing for that moment in the abstract since I was 7 years old, watching C-130s from the Peterson fence, and when the wheels touched down and the glider settled onto the grass, what I felt was not elation, but confirmation. the straightforward satisfaction of a calculation that came out exactly as expected. I entered the United States Air Force Academy in the fall of 2001, 18 years old, and certain about very little except that this was exactly where I was supposed to be. The Academy has a way of stress testing certainty, which is the point of it. By the end of the first semester, I had met Elena Voss, born July 19, 1982, and we had become study partners by December because we shared a particular refusal to perform ease we did not feel. Elena was faster with social instincts. She could read a room before most people finished their first sentence. I was steadier under extended pressure, the kind that compounds over days rather than minutes. We were useful to each other in different ways, and that dynamic served us across more than 2 decades and several dozen time zones without requiring adjustment. The Academy teaches you that competence is non-negotiable. What it doesn't teach you, what nobody teaches you, because it is the kind of knowledge that arrives only through lived experience, is that some people will still look at you like they are waiting for you to ask for directions. I filed that knowledge away without yet acting on it. I graduated in May of 2005, commissioned as a second lieutenant, and my father was in the stands in his dress blues. When the class of 2005 was called to attention, he stood at attention half a second before everyone else in his row. I always noticed things like that. Undergraduate pilot training at Columbus Air Force Base in Mississippi is where the selection pressure becomes real and the attrition visible. Half the class redirects or washes out over the course of training. I did not. I earned my wings in the summer of 2007, rated for tactical airlift, and when the instructor pinned them on my chest and shook my hand and said, "Welcome to the mission," I did not feel triumphant. I felt accountable. There is a difference between those two things, and it matters for everything that came afterward. I had been promoted to first lieutenant in December of 2006, 14 months into my commission and consistent with the Air Force mandatory promotion timeline, which is the way I prefer things to operate, on schedule, without drama. I arrived at Ramstein Air Base in Germany in August of 2007 for my first operational assignment. I was 24 years old, and I knew approximately as much about the real Air Force as any 24-year-old with wings and a strong academic record, which is to say enough to be functional and not enough to make expensive mistakes. In my first week at Ramstein, I attended a joint scheduling meeting where airlift and logistics officers coordinated cargo and personnel movement across the European theater. That was where I met Captain Michael Hadley. He was 29 years old, 5 years my senior in service, and he was running the meeting with the ease of someone who had been doing it for years. He acknowledged me during the meeting and afterwards stayed to walk me through the base's unwritten rules, which senior NCOs actually knew what was happening, which briefings were worth attending, which officers to steer clear of. It was useful information offered generously, without visible expectation of anything in return. By the end of September, we were eating lunch together 2 or 3 times a week. Hadley at 29 was someone it was easy to trust, senior enough to be genuinely helpful, junior enough not to be threatening, and possessed of the particular social fluency that comes from having read people carefully for a long time. He was charming in the efficient, considered way that politically aware officers tend to be charming, always calibrated, always aware of the effect. I found him good company. I also noticed and filed away the fact that he had never done anything operationally difficult and spoke about the operational world with the mild authority of someone who has read extensively about a country he has never visited. I noted it the way I noted all information that might be relevant later. "Ramstein's got a simple rule," he told me once in the scheduling office with his coffee cup in hand. "The people who actually run this place aren't the ones whose names are on the doors. Figure out who does the real work, stay out of the politics, and you'll be fine." I thought at the time that this was wisdom. I later understood it as autobiography. In November of 2007, I learned through the informal base network that Hadley was under quiet review. A supply chain audit had flagged an accounting discrepancy in his section, a significant error in airlift cargo, manifest that could, if escalated, result in a formal investigation that would follow him up the promotion ladder. He was not guilty of fraud. He was guilty of signing off on documentation he had not read carefully enough, which is a different category of failure, and one that ends careers not through malice, but through the compounding of small inattentions into a large consequence. I had, through my father's career and his network of contacts, a connection to a senior master sergeant in the base's logistics oversight chain, a man with the institutional credibility to reclassify a flagged error as an administrative correction rather than an investigation trigger if the circumstances warranted it and the documentation supported the reclassification. I reviewed what I knew about the discrepancy. The circumstances warranted it. I made the call. I did not tell Hadley what I had done. He figured it out in early December when the audit closed without consequence. He met me at the off-base cafe and was quiet for a long time before he spoke. "You didn't have to do that, Singer," he finally said. "Most people would have let it go." I told him it wasn't a big deal and meant it in the sense that I had not experienced it as a sacrifice. What I did not say, because I hadn't yet put language to it, was that I had done it because I believed he was someone whose career, given the right support, at the right moment, would become something worth the investment. That belief was the most expensive thing I carried for the next 17 years. I have thought about that November cafe since, the gray afternoon outside the window, the coffee that was always slightly worse than it should have been at that place. Hadley across the table, with an expression I had never seen on him before, something that looked genuinely close to gratitude. I think it was genuine. I think that was the problem. Real gratitude in a moment like that creates the impression of debt, of reciprocity, of a relationship that runs in both directions with equivalent weight. I built my half of the expectation on that impression. I spent 17 years finding out that the impression and the reality were two different things. We stood on the Ramstein flight line afterward in the gray November cold, watching a C-17 lift off into the low cloud deck. He was talking, base politics, I think, or the next rotation cycle. I was half listening and half watching the aircraft climb. Even then, even at 24, with everything still ahead of me, I was already somewhere else when a plane was in the air. That's just how it is. Over the years that followed Ramstein, my career moved in one direction and Hadley's moved in another. Mine went deeper, quieter, and increasingly classified. His went louder, more political, and progressively further from anything operational. I want to be honest about when I first noticed the divergence, because I've been asked about it, and the honest answer is early. Earlier than I chose to act on what I noticed. That gap between noticing and acting is the thing I've had the most time to think about since. In March of 2009, I was promoted to captain and deployed to Kandahar Airfield in Afghanistan to support combat airlift operations. Before I left, Hadley, promoted to major and reassigned to the Pentagon's Logistics Directorate, sent a congratulations email. It was 4 lines long, no phone call. I was deploying to a combat zone and received 4 lines of carefully punctuated text that communicated the precise minimum required by courtesy and nothing beyond it. I read it twice and replied with 3 words. Thanks, stay safe. I filed this information where I filed most information that didn't fit cleanly into what I already believed about a person, in a place I wasn't looking. I deployed, I flew. The margin in combat airlift is narrow and the cargo matters to someone in a way that makes inattention morally indefensible. I returned in 2011 with an air medal and a reputation for composure under fire that was accurate. Composure under fire is not a feeling, it is a practice, and I had been practicing it since I was a cadet. I took the medal and went back to work. In January of 2012, I was selected for the JSOC pipeline. I called Hadley. We spoke maybe twice a year by then, calls that had become professional courtesy, substituting for friendship without quite being it. I told him carefully, without operational detail, that my career was about to go dark. What I wanted from the call was acknowledgement that this was significant. What he gave me was something else. JSOC, he said, and there was a pause that ran 1 beat too long. That's interesting. You'll be off the radar for a while. Probably for the best. I hung up and sat with that for a minute. Probably for the best does a great deal of work in 4 words. It is condescending and distancing simultaneously, positioning the speaker as someone who understands the situation better than the person it is being said to. I noted it. I did not yet act on what I noted. In November of 2012, on my first classified extraction mission in northeastern Afghanistan, I earned the call sign WIDOWMAKER after executing a 0 visibility, low altitude extraction in conditions that should, by all standard metrics, have been a ground abort. The call sign was given by the team. I filed it alongside everything else and moved on. That's what you do. The Stuttgart meeting, April of 2013. I was 30 years old, still a captain, attending a NATO Joint Planning Coordination session as the operational liaison from my unit. Hadley was there, newly promoted to lieutenant colonel, running the logistics portion of the meeting, and I presented specific extraction route constraints for a corridor that logistics would need to factor into their planning. The information was accurate, current, operationally critical, and entirely my lane. When I finished, Hadley thanked me briefly and then turned to the senior logistics colonel in the room and said, "We'll want to verify that through the standard ops channel, classified work doesn't always translate cleanly to strategic planning." The other officers did not react visibly. Neither did I. That evening, I typed a detailed operational context memo, unclassified, and sent it to the logistics coordination email as a formal supplement. It was used in the final planning document. My name was not in the document. Hadley's section received attribution for the analytical framework. He didn't think he was doing anything wrong. That's the detail that stayed with me. He genuinely believed he was being efficient, filtering the signal, as he would probably describe it. Didn't occur to him that I was the signal. In January of 2018, at a joint session Pentagon briefing, Hadley, newly promoted to colonel, running a session on resource constraints in joint operations, made a general observation about special operations pilots who fly black and hide behind clearances, being out of touch with the real-world resource constraints that the rest of us manage. He said it with the mild, slightly amused tone of someone who considers themselves measured. I was in the room. I was the only person the comment clearly applied to. He did not look at me when he said it. He moved to the next slide. So I stayed for the full briefing, asked one precise question at the close, and drove back to my temporary quarters. I called Elena that night. "Are you going to say something to him?" she asked. "No," I told her. "I'm going to do my job." That's always been the answer. There was a pause on Elena's end that I recognized, the pause of someone who has more to say and is deciding whether to say it. She let it go. She knew me well enough by then to understand that when I said that, I didn't mean I was ignoring what had happened. I meant I was filing it correctly and moving on with the work. The job was always the answer, because the job was the thing that neither required justification nor could be dismissed by the people inclined to dismiss you. You could take a call sign away from a person. You couldn't take the record of what they did to earn it. And then came October of 2023. My executive officer, Lieutenant Colonel Marisol Reyes, born November 5th, 1980. One of the most operationally clear-eyed officers I have worked alongside, came back from a Pentagon coordination meeting and closed my office door behind her. She sat down and told me what Hadley had said at that meeting, that the briefing table was for operators, not paper pushers or ghost pilots. He said it loudly enough that 3 other officers heard it. It was not directed at anyone by name. Everyone in the room knew whose lane it was aimed at. "I wanted you to hear it from me before it got back to you another way," Reyes said. He said it like it was obvious, like nobody in the room would push back. She was right. Nobody did. And that told me something too, not just about him, but about how long I had been invisible, in rooms where I should have been seen. I listened to the full account without interrupting. When she finished, I thanked her, and we moved on to the agenda of the meeting we'd been about to have. But something had clarified. For the first time in 17 years, I was done filing things in places I wasn't looking. That evening, alone at my desk with the October light flat and low through the window, I picked up a pen and wrote one line in a small notebook, the date and the word enough. Then I put the pen down and opened the next file on my desk. There was still work to do. There was always still work to do. November 14th, 2024. I want to tell this part accurately, without amplification, because it does not require amplification. What happened in that war room was not spectacular. It was clarifying. The distinction matters to me. I arrived at the Pentagon 40 minutes before the scheduled brief. I was in my flight suit, the one I had flown into Andrews Air Force Base on that morning, the one I wear when I am working and not performing. The rank insignia on my collar were present but modest, appropriate to a lieutenant colonel attending a command brief. On my chest tab, in olive green thread, WIDOWMAKER. I checked in at the security desk, collected my visitor credentials, walked the E-ring corridor to the war room, and set my briefing folder on the prep table in the anteroom. I reviewed my first 3 slides. I checked the classified display connections. I took a drink of water. I was 41 years old and had run 47 classified extraction missions across 12 years of JSOC operational duty, and in approximately 30 minutes, I would brief a room of senior command on the Black Ops extraction package my unit had executed the previous February. The most complex mission we had run in 2 years. People always want to know if I was nervous walking into that room. I was not. I had landed aircraft in conditions that should not have permitted landing. I had made real-time extraction decisions with lives depending on the precision of my judgment. The Pentagon was a building. The brief was a brief. I walked through the door and saw him immediately. Colonel Michael Hadley, 46 years old, 1 grade above me on paper, was sitting in the chair at the head of the table reserved for the briefer. He had his badge folder open and was talking to Major Derek Cantu and Major Priya Osi. And whatever he was saying made both of them chuckle, in the easy, performative way of people who have learned that laughing at the senior person's remarks is professionally useful. He was holding court. The chair was a prop. I crossed the room toward my seat directly. Hadley looked up, took in the flight suit, the female officer with no visible rank stars beyond the modest silver on her collar, the call sign he did not recognize on her chest tab, and made his assessment in approximately 2 seconds. He waved me toward the door with the tips of his fingers. "You lost, darling. Briefings are for operators." Cantu and Osei laughed. I set my folder on the table in front of the briefer's position. I did not respond. I did not move from where I was standing. I simply waited, in the way you wait when you are entirely certain of what you are doing and you have the time to let the room arrive at its own understanding. I've been asked what I felt in that moment. The most accurate answer is nothing I hadn't felt before. Just the same old room and the same old assumption at a higher altitude. Across the table, General Raymond Howell, 4 stars, born August 22, 1960, the senior commander overseeing special operations, was reading a file at the far end of the table. He looked up, not because of the exchange. His eye caught the call sign on my chest tab. He froze. 1 breath of stillness, visible if you were paying attention. He had been reading mission reports filed under that call sign since 2019. He knew the operational record attached to it in the way senior commanders know the records they have chosen to track closely across years. He set the file down. He stood. He brought himself to attention and executed a clean, sharp salute. "Widowmaker," he said. "At ease, ma'am. I didn't see you come in." The room went absolutely still. Hadley's smirk was gone. He turned to look at me, really look, for the first time since I had crossed the room, and the color left his face in real time. His mouth opened slightly. He had realized, in the span of a single breath, what he had just said, and to whom, and in front of whom. Cantu and Osei were studying the table in front of them with the focused intensity of men who needed the table to be more interesting than it was. General Howell walked around the table. He spoke quietly to Hadley, a sentence or two, no raised voice. Hadley stood, picked up his badge folder, and found another seat. The general returned to his position. He looked at me and gave a single, precise nod. I gave him one back. Then I picked up my folder and dimmed the lights. I ran the brief for 90 minutes. The Black Ops package, its objectives, its execution, its outcomes, its lessons, the decision tree at the moment of extraction, precise language, exact coordinates and timelines. Every question from senior command fielded without hesitation and without amplification. My voice did not rise once. I did not editorialize. I presented what happened, what it meant, and what came next in that order, at the pace the information required. At the 40-minute mark, a 2-star general I did not know asked a question about extraction window tolerance under degraded visibility conditions. I answered in 90 seconds and then asked if he wanted the full analytical framework behind the tolerance calculation. He said yes. I walked him through it in another 4 minutes without referring to my notes. Hadley, at the far end of the table, did not look at me once during the brief. Cantu and Osei took careful notes on things that did not require notes. When I finished, General Howell said 2 words. "Thank you, Colonel." He used the courtesy title before I held the rank. I noted it. The room offered the appropriate acknowledgement. I collected my folder and began the post-brief protocols. I ran that room the way I run everything. Start on time, say what's true, don't waste the audience's attention, and get out clean. If you do those 4 things consistently, people understand what they are looking at. You do not have to explain it to them. The explanation is the work itself. Hadley was waiting by the door when I came out. He had prepared something, I could tell by the way he was standing, slightly squared up, the posture of someone who has rehearsed words and is waiting for the moment to use them. He said he owed me an apology, that he had not known who I was, that he hoped I understood. I stopped walking. I looked at him. I nodded once. Then I continued down the corridor and through the exterior door into the gray November afternoon. He needed me to release him from it in that hallway. I understood that. But the dignity of that room was never mine to hand back to him. He had taken it from himself, and he would have to find it, or not, on his own. That was not something I could do for him, even if I had wanted to. The flight back to Hurlburt Field was quieter than most. I had a window seat and didn't open my folder. I watched the eastern seaboard drop away below the aircraft and went through the day in sequence, beginning to end, the way I review mission footage, methodically, no skipping. I got to the moment Hadley said, "Darling," and held it there. Not with anger, though anger would have been reasonable, but with the specific, cold clarity of someone cataloging evidence who wants the catalog to be accurate. I had been in the military for 23 years. I knew the difference between a mistake and a pattern. What I had seen that morning, the ease of the dismissal, the assumption carried so lightly it didn't even warrant a pause, the immediate social permission Cantu and Osei received to laugh, that was not a mistake. That was what he believed, unguarded in a room he thought was his. There's a thing pilots do. When we debrief a difficult flight, we go back through every decision point and ask, at this moment, what did I know, and what did I choose to do with it? I did that with 17 years of Michael Hadley on a 3-hour flight from Andrews. The decisions I made with the information I had at each point were defensible. I just hadn't updated the calculation in a long time. I had been running on data from 2007 and calling it current. Reyes came by my office the morning after I returned. She had heard the shape of what happened, not the details, but the arc, through the informal network that moves faster than any official channel in any military organization. She closed my door and sat down and did not ask me how I felt. She asked me what I wanted to do. That is why I trust her. She doesn't lead with sympathy, because sympathy is a form of softening, and some things should not be softened. What happened in that war room should not be softened. I told her everything, the chair Hadley was sitting in, the word he chose, the way Cantu and Osei laughed. The exact second General Howell looked up and froze, the nod I gave before I dimmed the lights. All of it, in order, precisely. She listened without interrupting once. When I finished, she said 4 words. "Do you want documentation?" That question was the most useful thing anyone said to me in the 2 weeks that followed. Not, "I can't believe he said that," or "Are you going to be okay?" or any of the other phrases that are kind in intention and vague in utility. Just, "Here's the tool. Do you want it?" That's Marisol Reyes. I said, "Give me 2 weeks." I meant it as a timeline for deciding, not as a delay. In the evenings that followed, I built the timeline in my head the way I build a mission plan, from the first significant event forward, each entry with a date and a consequence. The 2007 audit, the 4-line email before Kandahar, the JSOC phone call, Stuttgart, the Ghost Pilot's briefing in 2018, the paper pusher's comment that reached me through Reyes in October 2023, and November 14th. What I found when I laid it out in sequence was not a collection of isolated incidents that could each be individually explained away. It was a pattern, consistent, sustained, 17 years long, of professional diminishment that had been absorbed, filed, and tolerated because the mission was always more urgent than the accounting. I spent 12 years flying missions where the math had to be right or people didn't come home. I applied that same standard to the mission and none of it to myself. The math on what I was owed, professionally, as a human being in an institution, with explicit rules about exactly this kind of conduct, I had simply never run. I'm not sure I thought I was allowed to. I called my father on a Sunday in early December. Gerald Singer, 72 years old, retired Master Sergeant, a man of minimal but precise language. I told him the facts of what had happened in the war room, because framing it as anything else would have struck him as imprecise. And imprecision is not a language he speaks. He was quiet for a moment after I finished. "Did you give the brief?" he asked. "Yes," I said. Then you did your job. A longer pause. File it, Steph. He didn't say what. He meant the complaint. He had spent 23 years inside the system and knew when its mechanisms were meant to be used. Those 2 words told me exactly what he meant. When my father says something with that kind of economy, he means it to be taken exactly at face value. He assessed the situation, determined the correct procedural action, and communicated it. That is his form of care. On December 10th, I went back to Reyes's office exactly 2 weeks after our first conversation. I sat down and said, "I want documentation." She already had the framework open on her screen. We spent the next hour building the formal record, Hadley's exact words, the witnesses present, the general's response, the complete sequence of events. We worked through it without heat. By the end of the hour, we had a comprehensive, accurate, signed, written account. The hardest part of signing that document wasn't the words. It was accepting that I was the kind of person who needed to file it. That the events it described were real and documented and not things I had imagined, and that imagining them would have been easier than acknowledging what they meant. I signed it. We filed the record. We didn't discuss it further that night. There was a readiness report due in the morning, and the morning was always coming. January 6th, 2025. I submitted the formal equal opportunity complaint on that date, the first Monday of the new year. The complaint cited the November 14th incident with specificity. Gender-based discriminatory language, the word darling, used by Colonel Michael Hadley in a formal command setting in the presence of 2 additional officers who responded with laughter directed at a female lieutenant colonel who was the designated briefer for a classified senior command session. The complaint was precise, documented, and signed. The equal opportunity officer received it without fanfare. The process began. People sometimes confuse filing a complaint with making a statement. I was not making a statement. I was using the system the way it is designed to be used, providing accurate information through the correct channel to the appropriate authority. That is not an emotional act. That is an operational one. 16 days after the complaint was filed, Hadley sent a private email to my official address. His legal office had clearly been involved in the phrasing. The sentences were careful in the specific way sentences become careful when a lawyer has reviewed them. He expressed regret for the misunderstanding at the November briefing. He stated that he intended no disrespect to my rank or service. He used the word misunderstanding twice. He did not, in 400 words, use the words, "I was wrong." I read the email once, forwarded it to my documentation folder, and did not reply. He used the word misunderstanding. I've thought about that choice since. A misunderstanding occurs when both parties walk away, confused about what was communicated. He was not confused. He knew exactly what he meant when he said it. What he misunderstood, the specific consequential thing he got wrong, was who he was saying it to and in front of whom he was saying it. That is not a misunderstanding. That is a miscalculation. In early February, Colonel Victor Marsh called. 51 years old, senior Pentagon logistics leadership, 12 years embedded in E-Ring institutional culture, and a professional ally of Hadley's through shared committee work. He called under the guise of checking in professionally. He was smooth and careful with his language. He talked about unit cohesion, about the logistics operations relationship, about how these things can develop into something nobody wants if they're not managed thoughtfully. He said Hadley was a good officer who made a poor choice of words under pressure. He was diplomatic. He was also doing exactly what he said he wasn't doing. I listened for 4 minutes. Then I said, clearly and without hostility, that the complaint had been filed through the proper channel, and I considered the matter appropriately placed. I thanked him for the call and disconnected. I had considered all the dimensions. That was the problem for him. I had spent 2 months examining every angle, and every angle pointed to the same conclusion. I was correct, the complaint was warranted, and the appropriate institutional response was for the investigation to proceed. In mid-February, Elena called. She had heard about the complaint through shared contacts. She did not ask whether I was sure. She knows better than that. She asked whether I was eating, sleeping, and flying. I said yes to all 3. She said good, and then moved to complaining about a logistics officer at Langley who had been scheduling her out-of-flight rotation incorrectly for 6 weeks, which made me laugh for the first time in longer than I had realized. We talked for 40 minutes about nothing dramatic. At the end, she said, "You always did the right thing in your own time. This is the same." I said I knew. The call ended. I sat with the quiet for a moment, and the quiet was mine. On March 3rd, 2025, I turned 42 years old. Reyes brought coffee to the office. Nobody made a speech. There was a readiness report due and a scheduling matrix to review, so I opened the next thing on my desk. The formal Equal Opportunity Investigation opened in April of 2025. I was interviewed. I provided my account in the same register I use for any formal brief, precise, sequential, without amplification. I was asked whether I believed the conduct was gender-based. I said yes, and explained why in specific and documentable terms. The specific language used, darling, is a form of address with no professional application in a command setting, carries a diminishing and gendered connotation when directed at a uniformed female officer by a uniformed male officer, and occurred in a formal setting in which the speaker was attempting to exclude the recipient from a space she had been officially designated to occupy. I was asked whether I had observed the response of Majors Cantu and Osei. I confirmed that I had and described it accurately. Audible laughter, brief, without visible discomfort from either party until the consequences of the exchange became apparent. The investigation was not in my hands after that. I provided what I had. I returned to Hurlburt Field, filed the investigation papers, and let the process run its course. People expect you to feel powerful when something like that is in motion. What I felt was quieter than power. I felt like I had paid a bill I had been carrying too long. The account was even. What happened next was the system's job. While the Equal Opportunity Investigation ran its course, the professional world continued at its own pace. The missions do not wait for the paperwork to clear. You plan the next mission, you fly it, you come home, you file the after action, and start planning the one after that. My JSOC extraction unit was tasked for 2 additional missions between April and August of 2025 across separate deployments and separate theaters. I planned both with the same methodology I bring to everything: meticulous route analysis, weather integration, contingency mapping, crew resource management rehearsals until the timing was precise. The first mission executed without significant deviation from the primary plan. The second involved a last-minute change to the extraction window, a shift of 22 minutes forced by a ground situation I had anticipated as a contingency and built a response for. I made the real-time call on approach. The call was correct. The package was secured. The team came home. Both missions were filed in the after-action system. I did not think about Hadley during either one. The missions don't care about your complaints or your commendations. They care about the math. That's always been the part of the job I trust most, the part where what you know is exactly as valuable as what you can do, and the scorecard is immediate. In May, Reyes returned from a Pentagon coordination meeting and brought news. Hadley had been removed from his joint planning position pending the investigation. He was still a colonel, still technically assigned to the Pentagon, but no longer at the table where decisions were made. His name was gone from the routing slips for the meetings he had been running. The social and professional network he had cultivated over a decade, the lunches, the informal briefings, the invitations to senior staff sessions, had become measurably quieter. Not loudly, not with an announcement, just a quiet, institutional rerouting around a source of risk. "He's not on the routing slips anymore," Reyes said. "His section is running the logistics coordination without him. Nobody said anything, they just stopped including him." That's how those rooms work. They don't announce when someone has become inconvenient. They just quietly reroute around them, the way water moves around an obstacle, without drama, without the obstacle necessarily being told it has been bypassed. It was the same mechanism he had applied to my operational input in Stuttgart in 2013. He understood it well. He had simply never accounted for the possibility that it might eventually apply to him. In June, I attended a joint coordination meeting at Eglin Air Force Base and found myself in the same room as Major Derek Cantu for the first time since November 14th. He was visibly uncomfortable when he saw me. Not hostile, not apologetic, just the specific, unmanaged discomfort of a person who knows what they did and has not worked out how to be in a room with the consequence of it. He sat on the opposite side of the table and did not make eye contact during the meeting. I addressed him once professionally about a logistics timeline question. He answered with precise brevity. After the meeting adjourned, he left the room quickly. He knew what he did. People always do. The question is only whether they decide that it matters. I found that when the consequence arrives, even a small one, even just the sustained discomfort of a shared room, they remember. They just wish they didn't have to. In August, my unit received its second Legion of Merit citation, awarded for the 2 missions executed that spring. The ceremony was small and contained. Unit formation, citation read, no press, no announcement outside the unit. The medal went in the same drawer as the first one. Reyes shook my hand. The unit went back to work. That evening I called my father. Gerald Singer said good and asked about the weather in Florida. That was not humility. That was just where awards went when I was too busy flying the next mission to frame the last one. Late August, after hours, I sat on the back step of my quarters in the warm Florida evening and let myself think about the past 9 months, not operationally, just as a person who had been moving at operational tempo for a long time and was briefly stationary. The investigation was still running. 2 missions completed. 49 total in 12 years of classified extraction work. The medals were in the drawer. My father had said good about the Legion of Merit in the same tone he would use to confirm that inventory documentation had come back clean. I had been in the Air Force since I was 18 years old, and I had never spent a quiet moment asking what all of it added up to when you stood far enough back to see the whole shape. I thought about the girl at the Peterson fence, watching C-130s lift into the Colorado morning, certain, without yet having words, for what she was certain about. That girl would understand this moment. She would not be surprised by the difficulty or the duration or the cost. She would recognize the direction. She had always known what direction this was. What she could not have predicted, and what I was still learning to sit inside, was that being right about the direction does not protect you from everything that happens along the way. It just means you keep moving in the right direction. You keep filing it and flying it and doing the work, and eventually the work becomes the record, and the record speaks in a room you don't even have to be in. I didn't feel like a different person at the end of that summer. I felt like the same person I had always been, moving through a space that had finally stopped pretending I wasn't in it. In September of 2025, Colonel Michael Hadley formally requested a professional meeting through official channels. I agreed, with conditions: legal representation present for both parties, no private communication before or after, 1 hour maximum, the agenda in writing 24 hours in advance. He agreed to all of them without negotiation. We met on September 18th in a neutral conference room adjacent to the Pentagon, both of us with JAG representatives seated to the side. He sat across from me and delivered what appeared to be a prepared but genuine apology. He said the word wrong 4 times over 45 minutes, which I counted because I count things by habit and because the repetition seemed significant. He did not ask me to forgive him. He did not ask me to withdraw the complaint, which was beyond both our reach by then. He said he had been doing what he called an honest accounting, and that he did not like what the accounting had produced. "I've been doing an honest accounting," he said in the flat afternoon light of a conference room that was not anyone's home territory. "I don't like what I found." I listened to the full 45 minutes. When he finished, I said, "I appreciate you saying it." I meant it precisely as what it was, a formal acknowledgement that the words had been received, not as anything beyond that. We shook hands. The JAG representatives filed the record. I left first. He used the word wrong 4 times. It was not enough to repair 17 years, and I did not come to that room expecting it to be. It was enough to be accurate about what had happened. The accuracy was the point. In October of 2025, the investigation concluded. The findings sustained the complaint. Colonel Hadley received a formal letter of reprimand, which was entered into his official personnel file, a significant consequence at the 06 level, particularly for an officer who had built his identity on Pentagon-adjacent positioning. He was laterally transferred from his Washington assignment to the Air Mobility Command Logistics Support Directorate at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio. He remained a colonel. The transfer was real, and the work was real, but the proximity to power he had spent a decade cultivating was gone. The letter of reprimand is a permanent file notation. The record knows what happened, even when the world does not. I was never asking for more than the record. The week after the investigation concluded, Brigadier General Carolyn Fitch called. She was 63 years old, my United States Air Force Academy mentor, 1-star general retired from active operations, but still connected to the Academy network. Still tracking my file from a distance she had maintained for more than 20 years. She had been at the academy during my 3rd year there, running the leadership development program with a rigor that I had found clarifying rather than punishing. She was one of the few people I had met in uniform who communicated authority through precision rather than volume, and I recognized the approach because I had learned it from my father first. She asked about the missions first, and then the unit, and then the condition of the training pipeline for the next rotation. And then she said, "I've been watching your file for a long time, Stephanie. What you did this year, not just November, the whole arc of it. That's the kind of thing that tells a promotion board who you are. Not the missions. This." I thanked her plainly and without deflection. I meant it without qualification. In November, Elena Voss came through Florida on a permanent change of station move and took a day off her travel schedule to come to Pensacola. We had dinner at a small restaurant, nothing distinguished about it, which was the point. We talked for 3 hours. She talked about her own career decisions and the ones that still sat at a slight angle when she looked at them directly. I talked about the aftermath of November 14th, not the incident itself, but what came after, what filing it had felt like, what the conclusion had felt like. Somewhere in the middle of the 2nd hour, she said, "You always moved through rooms like you were fine whether or not the room noticed." I thought that was confidence. I held that for a moment. "Both," I said. She laughed. The friendship was exactly what it had always been, which has always been the best thing about it. In late November, notification arrived that my name had been placed before the Air Force Colonel Promotion Board for consideration. I read the notification. I filed it in the drawer with the medals. I sent my father a 1-word text. "Board." He replied with 2 words, "About time." I read his reply twice, returned my phone face down to the desk, and went back to the readiness review. He had been waiting for that board placement longer than I had. 23 years of watching his daughter do work that mostly couldn't be discussed, and this was the signal he had been reading toward the whole way. He was right to wait. December of 2025 was quiet in the contained way that year-end periods are quiet, the administrative work of closing out a cycle rather than driving forward into new operational ground. Performance reviews for my team, after-action consolidations, equipment readiness logs. Rhea stopped by my office one afternoon to sign off on a routing slip and stayed for 10 minutes. She asked whether I had been thinking about what came next, not the promotion result, but the command assignment that would follow if the board selected me. I said I had. What I didn't say was that I had been thinking about it differently than I had thought about any previous assignment in my career. For the first time in 23 years, I had a clear sense of not just what the next mission was, but what I was building toward, what the shape of my command should be, what standard I intended to hold, what it should feel like to be a junior officer walking into a space I was responsible for. That was a specific and unfamiliar feeling, and I sat with it carefully. In mid-December, I saw the formal confirmation in shared administrative channels that Hadley's transfer to Wright-Patterson was complete. I read the assignment notation. He was heading the Logistics Support Directorate at Air Mobility Command. Real work, real contribution, but lateral and without the Pentagon proximity that had defined his professional identity for a decade. I sat with that information for the time it required. I checked his assignment the way you check a weather report once, so you know the conditions, and then you close the screen and plan accordingly. Wright-Patterson, Air Mobility Command Logistics Support. Honest work. I didn't need it to be worse than that. I never needed it to be worse than that. Brigadier General Fitch called again in January of 2026, not with news to talk. She asked what I was thinking about for the next chapter. Then she asked something more specific. If the board selected me and I was offered command, what did I want my command to stand for? Not operationally, philosophically. I was quiet for a moment before I answered. Then I said something I had not said aloud before, because I had not finished working it out until that moment. I told her I wanted to build a team that didn't need me to be remarkable in order to function. That I wanted to create the conditions, the standards, the culture, the baseline expectation about who belongs in every room, where the next Widowmaker didn't have to spend 17 years waiting for a 4-star to stand up before the room understood what it was looking at. Fitch was quiet on the line for a long moment. Then she said, "That's the right answer." That night I wrote 4 paragraphs in a small notebook and dated them. I didn't know yet that I would read them again in April. In February of 2026, the board notification arrived. Selected for promotion to colonel. Ceremony date confirmed. April 3rd, 2026, Hurlburt Field, Florida. General Howell would pin the eagle. I read the document in its entirety and set it on my desk. I sat entirely still for 5 minutes, which is unusual for me. I am not a person given to stillness except in aircraft, where stillness is a form of precision. But I sat with it. 23 years of exactly this kind of work, built exactly this way, and the board had looked at the full record and determined it was a colonel's record. That was accurate. It had been accurate for some time. The board, as my father had said, had finally caught up. Then I picked up my phone and called my father. He answered on the second ring. I said, "It's done, Dad." He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he cried. My father, who had stood at attention before anyone else at my commissioning in 2005, who had said, "File it," and "about time" in 7 words across 23 years, he cried. I sat with that on the phone and said nothing until he was ready. It was the most he had ever told me in any conversation we had ever had. And because he is the person he is, I understood that the crying was not about the promotion. It was about everything the promotion confirmed, that the record was what it was, that the trajectory was real, that the girl he had taken to the flight line fence in Colorado Springs had gone exactly where the math always said she would go. On March 3rd, 2026, I turned 43 years old. Near the end of March, 3 days before the ceremony, I found the 4 paragraphs I had written in January. I read them at my desk in the late evening. They still held, every word of them. I thought about the length of the road from Peterson to here, the girl at the fence, the academy, Ramstein, the JSOC pipeline, 49 classified extraction missions, a November war room, a formal complaint, a letter of reprimand in a permanent file, and this desk with this window. I had not yet finished understanding what all of it meant. I was not sure you ever finished understanding something that large, but I could feel from where I was sitting that the space ahead was wider than the space behind. I had not felt that in a long time. April 3rd, 2026, Hurlburt Field, Florida. The ceremony ran the way Air Force promotion ceremonies run, with efficiency, precision, and the institutional dignity that comes from doing the same essential thing the same essential way across decades. Unit formation in the morning light, the command element in position, the citation to be read. General Raymond Howell, 65 years old, all 4 stars precisely placed, stepped forward to pin the eagle. He pinned my left shoulder. He pinned my right. He stepped back. Then he did something that is not in the regulation. He shook my hand with both of his and spoke quietly so that only I could hear. "You were ready for this 7 years ago," he said. "I'm glad the board caught up." 7 years. 2019, the year I completed my 10th extraction mission, the year he first read a report filed under my call sign. I was 36 years old. He saw it then. He filed it in the right place and waited for the board to arrive at the same conclusion. When the command was given to dismiss, my father, 74 years old, in civilian clothes in the front row, having flown in from Colorado Springs the day before, moved through the formation with the exact precision of a man who spent 23 years in uniform and has not forgotten a single protocol in the decade since he retired. He found me. He did not hug me, not in front of the assembled unit. He placed his hand on my shoulder, once, and looked at the colonel's eagles on my collar for a long moment. Then he nodded. I nodded back. That was the conversation we needed to have. The morning after the ceremony, I was on the flight line at 0530. No mission package, no passengers, no operational objective. I had arranged a training sortie, 2 hours, solo, over the Gulf of Mexico. The first time in months I had been alone in an aircraft with nothing required of me except to fly. I took off into the pre-dawn dark, climbing through the thin cloud layer into the clear air above. And by the time the sun came up, I was at altitude over the Gulf, watching the water below reflect the early light back in a way that I have never been able to describe to someone who has not seen it from a cockpit. I did not have a specific thought during that flight. That was exactly the point. I was 43 years old, and I had been a pilot for 19 years, and that morning I was flying because I wanted to, and that was the only reason that needed to exist. The aircraft responded to the trim the way aircraft respond when you have 10,000 hours in type, and the relationship between your hands and the machine is a conversation rather than a negotiation. The light on the Gulf changed slowly as the sun climbed. I've been asked, since everything that happened across those 2 years, whether the job still feels the same. The answer is no, it feels better. Because I understand now what I have been protecting all along. Not just the mission, not just the team, not just the Air Force as an institution. I have been protecting this. The pre-dawn flight line, the aircraft responding honestly to your hands, the light coming up across the water below you. The part of it that was always just mine. The part that no one's assessment of me, accurate or dismissive, ever had the power to take. After I landed, I called my father from the flight line. He was already up. That is a habit that doesn't leave you after 23 years. I told him about the flight. He asked about the weather over the Gulf. I told him it had been clear. He said that was good flying weather. We were quiet for a moment, and then I said, "Thank you, Dad, for file it." He said, "You did the filing?" "You told me to," I said. "You would have got there," he said. "Maybe," I told him, "but you got me there faster." Another pause, the comfortable kind. Then he said, "The eagles look right." I laughed. He did too, a short, private sound he reserves for when something has genuinely caught him. The call lasted 17 minutes. It was the best conversation I'd experienced in a year. 10 days after the ceremony, I sat at dinner in Pensacola with Reyes and Elena, the same small restaurant where Elena and I had eaten the previous November, because neither of us was interested in finding somewhere different. 3 hours of conversation that moved between the professional and the personal with no clean border, because that's how it goes when the people involved have known each other long enough that the border isn't useful. Reyes made me laugh twice before the appetizers arrived. Elena told a story about a navigational error she had made in 2011 that she had never told anyone in full, because it ends with a safe landing and no one finding out, and she had been carrying 14 years of suppressed, near-miss comedy. I told them about the 4 paragraphs I had written in January. I read them aloud at the table. When I finished, neither of them said anything for a moment. Then Reyes said, "That's the CO I want to work for." And Elena said, "That's the CO I always knew you'd be." We sat with that for a moment, then someone refilled the glasses and the conversation moved on, because that's what real friendships do. They hold the important thing just long enough for it to register, and then let you keep living. Early May of 2026. My new command office at Hurlburt Field, larger than the last one, with a window that looks directly over the flight line, which I had not had before, and which I appreciated more than I could have predicted. On the back of the door, my old flight suit, the one with the worn places at the collar and the knees and the left elbow, the specific locations that wear when you wear a garment in the actual conduct of actual work. WIDOWMAKER, still legible on the chest tab in olive green thread, a little faded but clear. I had not retired it. I had not put it away somewhere that implied it was finished. It was on the door, because that is where a flight suit belongs when you are between missions. On the desk, a readiness report, a scheduling matrix, and a personnel file for a new addition to the unit. A 28-year-old captain who had just been selected for the JSOC pipeline. The selection board's note read, "Exceptional spatial reasoning. Outstanding composure under pressure. Recommend unreservedly." I read it once. I sat for a moment and thought about who I was at 28, a captain in the same pipeline, calling a person I had trusted, who said, "That's interesting, probably for the best," filing it, moving on. I picked up a pen and added a handwritten line at the bottom of her welcome file. 4 words. "This room knows you." Reyes knocked and came in. She glanced at the flight suit on the door and said nothing about it. She set a coffee on the edge of the desk and said, "Command brief in 30. "I'll be ready," I told her. I will always be ready. That's the part that has never changed and will not change. I put those 4 words in that captain's welcome file as information, not comfort. As a standard, not a gift. She would walk through the door of this unit as a person already understood, already measured accurately, already placed where her record says she belongs. That is what I intended to build here. The flight suit is still on the door. The window still looks over the flight line. The work is still the work. If you have been waiting for a room to recognize you, stop waiting. Build the record. File what needs to be filed. Fly the missions that nobody writes about. And when you finally walk into that room, walk in like you already know the answer to every question they're about to ask. Because you do. You have been the answer all along. The room just hadn't caught up yet. Let them catch up. Then go build the next one. I spent years proving myself in silence. But silence was never the same as weakness. If this story reminded you of a time you had to choose yourself, tell me in the comments. Have you ever had to walk away from someone who refused to respect you? Have you ever finally spoken up after staying quiet for too long? Like, subscribe, and share this with someone who needs to remember their worth.